When and why did youth work start?
Well, if you want to trace when youth work started, you have to go back at least 175 years, I think. You would be talking about the origins of the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, way back in the 1840s. That prompted a much wider set of developments into the later 19th century and into the 20th century, where, and again I'll mention these later, there were important pioneers who set up, interestingly, separate boys' clubs and girls' clubs. And the development of mixed clubs was a later and somewhat, at times, contentious issue, I think. Why did they set them up? Well, many of those people were from upper class backgrounds, often with strong religious motivations. Christian, but also Jewish. There were very, very significant youth work developments within the Jewish community. And one of the things clearly that they were wanting to do was to bring young people into their beliefs, or make sure that they were secure in those beliefs if they already had them. They also had wider, more kind of self-centered motives as well, I believe. They were very, very keen, for example, to make sure that young people were responsible citizens, that they were efficient workers, that they were good parents, and these are all phrases that were likely to be around, I think. Or maybe I've just added them on, I don't know. But anyway, they certainly had those kinds of concerns. But it is also important to say that they were altruistic in many, many ways. They were a bit patronising perhaps sometimes in the way they described it. They certainly saw these as lower class young people who needed to be improved, those kinds of things. But nonetheless, underlying that, there was what has become embedded in youth work, as in other practices, really, really important concerns and objectives. And that was to give these young people the best opportunities they could to develop themselves, discover their talents, express their talents, and improve their lives.
What is youth work and what is special about how it works with young people?
I interpret the first one as being very much about the purpose of youth work, what youth workers are trying to achieve. And that, for me, is about really trying to stretch young people in ways that they've not been stretched or developed before. I mean, my favourite phrase is, I hope that we can enable young people not just to go where they've never been before, but where they've never dreamed of going. And so that would be my take on what is youth work. Now, what is special about it? I need here to give a caution before I get into that, because I'm really keen to make it clear that I'm not saying that youth work is a better practice than, say, a really, really good teacher in a classroom, or a really good social worker, or a really good careers advisor. All those practices have their own qualities, and they bring really, really important gains to young people. So it isn't about arguing that this is a better practice. But my argument is that it is a different practice. In fact, it's a distinct practice from others. And I have a number of reasons for saying that. But the two that I would particularly want to stress, and one, that this is a practice that young people join voluntarily. they choose to join. And not only do they choose to join, they choose whether to stay, and they can choose whether to go away. I'm tempted to swear there, but nonetheless, I mean, that is a really important factor. And one of the things about that, and I'll come back to this perhaps later, is that because they have that choice in the relationship, they have a level of power in the relationship which they do not have in most other situations, particularly in school, for example, but often with social workers and so on. So that choice is an absolutely fundamental, what I call, feature of the practice. And the other one that I would want to emphasise is that it's a practice that, partly, mainly perhaps because of that choice, has to start with the concerns and the interests and the priorities, not just of young people in general, but of the young people who actually turn up. So it imposes on the youth worker a practice process, which means that they have to begin by working with these young people and building trust in order that they can begin to identify what it is that these young people really want out of it. So that for me would be, I could name other things, but those two for me would be the really, really defining features of practice that distinguishes it from other practices. What I would want to add, I think, about what makes youth work a distinctive practice are two or three other things, because I think they are really quite important to record. One of them is that youth workers start with young people as individuals for who they are, and particularly avoiding the pressures to engage with them as problems to be sorted and so on. These are individual young people, individual human beings who turn up and who youth workers try to engage with for who they are as those individuals. But secondly, and there's some kind of contradiction in this perhaps, they also take into account the fact that young people so often engage with youth work and with youth workers, with their mates, in their groups, in their peer groups, which are very, very important to many of them. Not always positive, but nonetheless very, very, very important for them to be part of those. And therefore the youth worker needs always, and is always willing, I hope, to be working with them, with and through those group relationships, including trying to not just support those group relationships, but use those groups as processes, opportunities for doing the developmental, the educational work that they want to do with them. And I think the third thing that I would want to emphasise, which again other practices don't always have the chance to take into account, is that youth worker will engage with young people in relation to their wider community and cultural identities, as young women, as black young people, for example, gay and lesbian, whatever it may be, disabled, and work with those as the young person would bring them and as the young person would define them, and again see them as possible routes to opportunities for those informal educational developments that's at the heart of youth work.
What does it look like when it's happening and what effects can it have?
Well, what youth work looks like when it's happening varies in lots of ways. I mean, what you might actually see going on is, say, a drama group or a music group or a sports coaching group, which is very, very focused in on the activity and maybe getting the very best quality for that activity they can do. And the youth worker will certainly concentrate on that and value that. But as a youth worker, working with those in those more formal, more structured situations, they will also be keeping a very, very close eye on the dynamics of the group, the relationships between the young people, the power structure within the group. They will be working really hard to influence those, not just in the direction of making sure that the activity is high quality, but also that in personal and interpersonal ways, young people are taking from that experience more than just that they're getting the skills in the sports or the music or whatever. So that is and should never be underestimated as a very, very important way that youth work operates, what youth work will look like to the outsider. A lot of it will be hidden from the outsider actually, but nonetheless, that's what it might look like. But youth work is much broader than that. Youth work will happen when, for example, just as a young person arrives in the club, how they're greeted by the youth worker, group of kids sitting around in a coffee bar, youth work goes over and has a chat with them. There'll be those kinds of much more informal and spontaneous arenas where the youth worker will be really, really exercising, drawing on their skills to try and build a trust with the young people and get the development activity going on. Trying to establish what effects youth work has on young people will of course depend on who you ask. But with my youth work head on, whose words would I want to give priority to, but young people's words. And what I want to do is to just share with you some quotes that have been gathered from young people about their experience of youth work by a number of different research projects. So, for example, I make new friends at the club. I get creative, do activities. It's good to know about sexual health and knowing that we can get access to contraception through the youth workers. You actually learn from youth workers a lot. They change the mentality when you're actually out and about with your mates and you see stuff going on. It's helpful with the COVID situation, they give you masks. I saw youth workers about and then we did my CV. My youth workers managed to get me a place at college I'm at now. Speaking to youth workers made me think, it's just not me who lives on this estate, it's about everyone who lives on this estate. I don't think I need to add any more to that. I think those are very, very powerful messages.
Given the chronic cuts across many sectors, youth work included, what can you see as the future for youth work?
The chronic cuts across youth work have been absolutely devastating. and have in many, many areas, well, removed youth work facilities completely. There is some anecdotal evidence now that you might say to a 13 or 14-year-old these days, what about your local youth club? And they'll look at you and not even know what you're talking about. So we are starting from a pretty desperate situation. Now, the Johnson government did, well, let me just say first of all, there have been little bits of evidence of pickup. For example, that the number of courses for youth workers have increased a little over the last 2 or 3 years. And the Johnson government did promise something like £560 million to refurbish and build new youth clubs and youth spaces for young people, although that money also has to be shared with organisations like the Scouts and the Guides and the National Citizen Service. And also, that money has been very, very slow in coming through. Even if it all came through, it still stops a long way short of reinstating the losses that have been made since 2010. So, the future for youth work? Well, I don't think the prospects are great. Our new Prime Minister seems to be promising us a new round of cuts, a new era of austerity. So what have we got to do? We've got to keep fighting, we've got to preserve what we have already. Like organisations like Chilypep have got to be sustained. And we need to keep challenging. We need to keep on saying, this is a really, really important practice for young people, and we demand that you provide the resources for it.
What is your favourite part of youth work and what has been your best moment?
I find it very hard to separate out my favourite parts of working as a youth worker from my best moments. Clearly, the context for that is where you believe that you might actually have had some impact on the lives of young people, that things have come out of the experience of working with them which have been really beneficial and developmental for them, and which they've taken away and been able to make good use of later in their lives as well as then. And actually to try and bring that to life a bit, and certainly reflecting some of the best moments and the favourite moments of my youth work practice, I want to draw on my experience of 7 years as a volunteer in a youth club in a small industrial town where my wife was the part-time leader in charge. So we were living close to the shops and the pubs that they went to, just down the road from the schools they went to, using the park that they hung out in. And this resulted in, for example, a young man knocking on our door at 8 o'clock in the morning and saying, "I'm in court this morning, will you come with me?" Or a group of kids appearing at our door at lunchtime with their butties and sitting round our kitchen table while our son was having one of his bad moments. But it also resulted in really positive things like very reluctantly persuading a group of young people to go to see a play in the local professional theatre and coming away really delighted with it. Who knows what those kinds of experiences have resulted in. One marker, though, of all of that for me over the years of the pleasures and the really positive experiences of being a youth worker is the friendship that we made with a young woman who lied about her age so she could get into the club at the age of 13, stayed in contact with us, came to visit us many, many times over the years after we moved out of that town, travelled to get to see us, and who last year, at the age of 67, retired, is still in touch with us. What more could you want from a youth work experience for something like that?
What would you say to someone who was thinking about going into youth work?
So what would I say to somebody who's thinking about becoming a youth worker? Good on you. I think if you've had some experience yourself on the receiving end of youth work, and that's actually pushing you in the direction of thinking you might do that, I think that's a really important positive starting point, because you would be coming into that with something personal to draw on. It wouldn't just be an abstract thing. You would have some sense of what was involved and some positive views of that would be really important. What I think one really good reason for people to commit themselves to youth work, especially if they're coming with their own personal positive experiences of it, is that for many, many young people who never ever make it in school, never ever really adjust to what school demands of them or see school as a positive experience, this can turn out to be an alternative way for them to develop and to get new opportunities that they never ever experienced. And the other side of that is that actually to become a youth worker, you don't necessarily, certainly not at the early stages, have to go through that formal education system. I mean, you know, to qualify as a youth worker, you do need to get a degree these days, but there are many, many routes into doing youth work which are much more open and much more accessible and much more welcoming to people who don't necessarily or not yet ready to get caught up in the formal education system.